Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton. And this week I realize is still Suicide Awareness Month. So we've had to reshuffle a couple of things for scheduling. So we are actually going to go back to suicide awareness in the first week of October. And this week we're going to slot in a different episode. So we will wrap up and we will have our full 4 episodes, but for scheduling reasons, we've just had to kind of rearrange things a little bit. So this week, we're going to get into oppositional defiant disorder. And this comes from a listener story, which we always appreciate when our listeners allow us to kind of give real world applications, which we are always happy to do, to give advice and allow Dr. Burton to give his expertise in these areas. But we will also make it general to just in some general ways to how to deal with oppositional defiance disorder, because it is a real thing and it can be very, very difficult to deal with. So I'm going to start by getting into this listener story, and she has requested to be anonymous. So I will just refer to them as mom, dad, and daughter. So those are the key players in this story. So I'm going to read this story and Dr. Burton and I will discuss
and then
it.
We'll talk about it. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So she got married and had a son, and then she ended up divorcing this guy because he was addicted to prescription drugs and emotionally abusive. And so he then went on to commit suicide when her son was 5 years old. So that's kind of an important part of her backstory, because it probably plays into some of the trauma and some of the difficulties that have been going forward with this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So she met her now husband and got married after 5 years of dating. And her son was 2 and his daughter was 3 when they met. And then they had another daughter around the time of getting married. So she has been in her stepdaughter's life since she was 3 years old. Her mother left her. So her stepdaughter's mother left her when she was only 9 months old. So her husband has full custody. She has stepped in and taken on the motherly role. And so she goes on to say, I was the caregiver most of the time while my husband worked long hours. I do not have a religious background, but I have strong values, morals, and expectations. I was a good kid growing up and did not have many issues other than some depression from time to time. My husband also came from a broken home, but had a normal life and religious upbringing. He did get into drugs when he was a teen, but quickly grew out of it at the time of having his daughter. At the beginning, my husband and I mostly agreed on how to raise our children. Due to the trauma that his daughter faced as a child, we started noticing the following behaviors at a very young age. She was diagnosed with ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder. She had behaviors like lying, stealing, getting into and wrecking things, disrespect, and not accepting boundaries. We did multiple things to try and help her and try to improve her behavior. She has been to 3 different counselors, one saying there's nothing else we can do. These are behavioral issues and nothing will get better until she chooses to change her behavior. When starting grade school, the teachers requested she be evaluated and she was put on medication that helped with her hyperactivity, but nothing has helped the other behaviors. The lying, stealing, and defiancy was a very hard thing for me due to my morals, values, and the fact that I had 2 other children that were expected to follow the rules that she was not. I was the one that was the main disciplinary, and my husband kind of stood back and let things happen. He was a Disneyland dad. My husband and his family felt bad for her and did not like that she was in trouble all the time. I have never been around any of these behaviors, so I had no idea how to navigate it. I initially would get upset and yell and try everything I could to get her to obey, but nothing I did ever made any improvements. Once she hit her teen years, I admit I kind of gave up and figured at this point there was nothing I could do anymore to change her behaviors, and that was something she was going to have to do. if it was important enough for her to continue good relationships. I feel like I did my best to try to instill good morals and values, and it does not seem like she cares. It seems like at times she is emotionless or does not have a conscience. I began to set boundaries for myself because I was making myself crazy and feeling bad about myself, thinking that I caused this or was making things worse. Throughout the years, my husband and I would get into bad disagreements about the kids, his daughter's behavior, and that things were not fair. Other than the issues we had with her, my husband and I get along well when it comes to parenting the other kids. And when it's just the two of us, we get along very well. Neither of us wants a divorce. We're just trying to navigate through the situation as best we can until she is an adult and can move out on her own.
Okay.
She's only 17.
Right.
She's like, and she says she admits she made a lot of mistakes raising her and she tries to do better, but she wants to make sure how she's handling things now is appropriate and what she should do going forward. So she also admits at this point she does not like or have anything in common with her, and she refuses to be around the behaviors. I've spoken to her on a couple of different occasions and let her know my point of view and what my boundaries are, and that if she chooses those behaviors, I am going to remove myself. I don't really have a relationship or talk to her at this point. If I do, she's rude and disrespectful to me. She will only talk to her dad, and they have a best friend type of relationship that I don't agree with. And I am the mom and not a best friend. My husband and I recently got into a disagreement about how I was treating her. I told him that I felt pressure to fill the void of her trauma of her mom leaving her and not having her mom in her life, and that I couldn't fix her. My husband admitted that he basically lets her do what she wants because he is scared she will commit suicide because of her mental health issues. Though I care and love her and want to see her be happy and successful, I do not want to tiptoe around the rest of my life. As you can see, everyone in our family has been through trauma, and I don't feel like that is an excuse. I have a positive mindset and feel like we should learn to rise above and do better. I am scared that the cycle will continue and she will stay living in our home and not following the same expectations the other kids have and being disrespectful. My husband's head is in the sand and thinks it could be worse, but I know she is doing drugs and skipping school and things, and that is not acceptable to me living in our home. She has a girlfriend and no other friends or outlets. It is a very controlling, toxic relationship. What can I do, if anything, to be better to prevent resentment with my stepdaughter husband and other children in the home? My husband refuses to go to counseling. So, initial thought.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts. So I think that, I guess initially, they are not a parenting team,
Yeah.
right? And the hardest relationship, if you blend families, the very hardest relationship is always between a stepmother and a stepdaughter.
Hmm.
And I don't know that anybody really understands the reason, but I think most people are in agreement that that is the most difficult relationship. And so I think early on, so at 9 months, the bio mother of this girl leaves, a 17-year-old leaves. I would guess at some point the girl got a diagnosis of reactive attachment disorder. She's been in therapy.
Yeah.
She has that diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder and ADHD. Now, I'm certainly not arguing with the diagnosis. I wouldn't have any reason to. I think that it's important to understand that if you look at it from a brain perspective,
Hmm.
a psychiatrist or a medical doctor might say she was born this way.
Right.
I don't know that I believe that. I think that there's some confusion or disagreement around, say, oppositional defiant disorder, because for me that's a precursor to antisocial personality disorder. Oppositional defiant is certainly a diagnosis that applies to children and adolescents, and then once you hit a certain age, I can't remember what it is. Once you hit a certain age, it transitions into a different diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. Neither one is good, but the questions I have, we don't know if the bio mother was a drug user.
Hmm.
And so, in that case, if she was a drug user, especially when this girl was in utero, then that has all sorts of negative effects
Right.
on the brain. Again, so we don't know that. That would be, say, an example of how physiologically she came this way. She was born
Hmm.
this way because it's possible. See, I'm not saying I know this, but possible drug issues. Now, the other thing is that we've talked about, I think, on previous episodes, is that if you have trauma in your
Yep.
life, then you behave just in exactly the same way as if you have ADHD. It's been one of my complaints about in school and having the diagnosis of ADHD is that often that the people who are treating the child don't look at what's going on in the home.
Right.
And I think it's really tied. ADHD, in my mind, I think it's overdiagnosed
Mm-hmm.
these days, but I think mostly it's because of the disruptions in the home. And I get why that's tough for a school to do that. I mean, if it's a teacher, I think statistically the teacher's the one who's most often pushing the diagnosis of ADHD because then, the thinking is get them on medication and then the behavior changes, which often it does. So
Right.
I understand why it happens, but I just think that the trauma. So this listener writes about the trauma. They've all had trauma. That is certainly true. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
that they've all experienced different types of trauma. And the reason I bring that up is that's the other thought about ADHD and say oppositional defiant disorder, that it's caused by environment. But
Okay.
as we've talked about before, there's always a combination of nature and nurture, right?
Right.
I think that's true with everything. But then also, I talked about the brain and behavior and experience changes the brain. So in any case, her brain is wired differently. It's
Mm-hmm.
just if it's important to figure out, well, where does that come from? I don't know that it's that important to figure out. I just thought I'd give the different ideas of where things like this originate.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I think the biggest thing that stands out is the lack of, say, influence or involvement of the bio father
Yeah.
in creating a structure and expectations and consequences.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've certainly seen this before, and I don't think there's a gender issue, meaning does it happen more with moms or dads? I've seen it happen with both moms and dads. And so my husband and his family felt bad for her
Right.
and did not like that she was in trouble all the time. And that's a real indicator that I'd say they're feeling guilty,
Mm.
which is what I often see. So bio dad feels guilty, family feels his extended family feels guilty, and of course I feel bad for her. I mean, just hearing about it, I feel bad for her. Empathy for her and what she went through.
Right.
But the result of that, the feeling guilty for what she's been through, her bio mom leaves her, she has this
Mm-hmm.
behavior, she's in trouble, is that they pull back and they don't put the expectations and the boundaries
Right.
and around her behavior. And so she grows up with very few boundaries or expectations on appropriate behavior. And so I think that fundamentally is the problem. And I think that parents and grandparents think, oh, she's had such a hard life, let's not make it harder.
Mm-hmm.
That is absolutely the worst thing you can do for a
Yeah.
child in that case. Because if you think about it, at some point, so she's 17 now, she's still in the home. She isn't always going to be in the home. At some point, she'll
Right.
leave. And so I think one of our primary tasks as parents is to raise children who can get along in the world. And so if her first, 18 years of life is pretty much no boundaries or expectations, especially from the father. Now, the listener, I agree, has tried to do that.
Right.
But as you and I have talked about many times, with the benefit of having, two parents, one, you have different approaches, but you have two people
Mm-hmm.
who are enforcing the expectations and consequences in a loving way, hopefully. In some ways, if the listener were doing this on her own as a single parent, it probably would be more effective.
Yeah.
Just because,
I think you're right. And so one thought that I keep having is with children who are, it almost seems like you might call it chronic problems or like they're chronically in trouble. They're constantly
hmm
in trouble. And
yeah,
so it's almost like this self-fulfilling prophecy type thing where it's like,
hmm
because this kid makes a mistake, they're perceived as a bad kid. So people treat them differently. And so it's almost like this perpetual cycle.
it
I'm a
is.
bad
Yep.
I'm a bad kid. So I do bad things. That's what people expect of me. So I'm just going to keep doing it because that's all anybody thinks of me. The best remedy is to break this cycle. How do you
hmm
help her realize she's not a bad kid. She's just making poor choices.
So that's the problem. At 17, that becomes
Yeah,
much, much more difficult. And so,
exactly. Yeah.
as a young child, that would have been entirely possible to do that. So here's another thought, and this is maybe a lot of this episode is going to be focused on parenting and
Mhm.
how sometimes I think the father certainly loves his daughter,
Yeah.
but I think made some terrible mistakes. And so another reason I think this is especially true when kids are younger, where they keep that cycle of,
Yeah.
doing things that are wrong, is I really believe, and I think Lindy, who works with kids, would certainly say this, that kids feel safer with those boundaries.
Yes.
And I think sometimes they push and they do these things in order to get, and it's just subconscious, but in order to get, say, the parent in this case, to put some boundaries around them and keep them safe.
Mhm.
And the child, once you do that at any age, the child's always going to push back for a time.
Right.
And that, for a lot of parents, they really don't tolerate that well. And when I'm talking to parents about that, about changing the way they set boundaries, is they don't like it. The child pushes back, and for a time, not
Mhm.
forever, for a time, the behavior gets worse
Yes.
because
Yeah.
the child is trying to bring it back into, the way it was. And
Mhm.
so the parents, well, in this case, the stepmom and the bio father they weren't working together as a team. And so stepmom was trying to do this. It's not going to work very well without the support of, well, I don't know that it'd work at all without the
Mhm.
support of bio dad. She was in almost an impossible situation here,
Yeah.
seeing, because you can step back often as a step parent and you can see what's going on. And you
Mhm.
can see, she says, when the bio dad has a friendship relationship with the daughter. I mean, she's absolutely right. She's the parent. I don't think it ever works when if you're a parent, you're trying to be friends with your kids.
There's got to be a balance because on the one hand, I understand, especially in the teenage years, I understand that parents desire to try to be there for their kid because on the one hand, it almost feels like they can have a positive influence if they can be involved in their kid's life because if their kid is feels like a friend and they trust them, it's like, oh, I can be a positive influence. The problem is there's a lack of safety there. And so
Right.
and this is a clear example of why it doesn't work because as you can see is she's still making all of these terrible choices. And so one thing that really sticks out to me is that all of these counselors that she's been to that have said these are behavioral issues and nothing will get better until she chooses to change her behavior. That is unfortunately very true because the
Well,
hard one of the hardest parts about parenting has got to be agency. The fact that kids are going to make choices and there's nothing you can do about it.
that's true. I believe that. And the problem is she's 17. And so,
Yes.
the idea at 17 is you have more agency.
Yep.
But the real problem is when she was 10
Yeah.
or younger, that's when you don't really have that agency, and the parents there to guide and set the boundaries, and that's what didn't happen. And so she
Mhm.
didn't learn that there are
Yep.
actually boundaries or expectations around her behavior. And I think that, going back to what I said earlier, where it seems like the dad and his family want to be more lenient because they feel
Right.
bad for
Mhm.
what this girl has experienced, which I agree with. It's terrible that she experienced these things. That is not doing her a favor, and it sets her up for failure throughout her life. Those steps in parenting that we talked about before, to have really clear expectations about
Mhm.
behavior. That's the first step, and that's usually pretty easy for parents. Now, when I'm bringing this up, in this case, they needed to be a team,
Yeah.
and it sounded to me like stepmom was trying to do this on her own, but that's a setup for failure.
Yeah.
If the dad isn't involved. So clear expectations, clear consequences or rewards. And then the next steps, you have to be consistent and you have to always follow through.
Mhm.
That requires working together, though, as
Right.
parents. And so I think the failure, in my mind, is, she's 17, struggling with these behaviors, not doing well in school
Yep.
or drugs, friends, everything.
Mhm.
And I think the failure, I'll make a I don't know if this is a bold statement. I think the dad failed her.
Yeah.
I don't think he
And
meant to.
no, he didn't. I think that, I mean, they were there. This family is in an incredibly tough situation. And I
Yes.
think they were all just trying to do the best they can. It sounds
Yeah.
like they spent a lot of time in survival mode.
I agree. Yes. All of that. And so, yeah, they're just trying to survive, but still. So the other thing that she writes that I think is probably true, her husband has his head in the sand.
Yeah.
It's like he's refusing to look at it and refusing to think that there could be a different way.
Well, and I think another thing that's telling is he's like, well, it could be worse,
Right.
which I mean, it
Yes,
it
I
it
guess.
could be, and so it's almost like it almost seems to me like maybe he's just hoping that she's going to get out of it, right? She's going to
She,
come through this difficult phase, which she very well may, or
I
she may end up in jail.
I think statistically it becomes less and less
Yeah,
likely as she gets
yeah,
older. If if they had had a good conversation and became a team back when she was a
right.
child, pre-adolescent, then they wouldn't be facing this. I mean, she may
So,
still have some issues. I'm not saying that
right,
there wouldn't be
right,
any issues, but they would certainly be different and less serious. And so, if we get to the question
yeah,
at the very end, what can I do, if anything, to better prevent resentments with my stepdaughter, husband, and other children? I'm hopeful that the writer, the listener, is, hopefully she hears this episode. My feeling is she's done about everything she possibly can.
yeah,
And she's tried to do it on her own.
hmm
And that's just, I don't see how that was ever going to work. And that's not about her.
hmm
That's about being a team and having the dad be involved. So my suggestion is to try and have that empathy for her stepdaughter. I
yeah,
think is the best place to go with it. Realize she has had a difficult life, but the stepdaughter's father, the writer's husband, has not done what's really best for the child.
hmm
So the resentments that I'm worried about for the listener who wrote this, the resentments for the husband, I think, for not being involved, for having his head in the sand, not really stepping up to do what is appropriate for this 17-year-old girl. And I worry that it's too late.
It could be. And so I think the only thing that this listener can do is continue to set the boundaries and just be clear. And it's not that she has to write off her stepdaughter.
No,
It
I wouldn't say that at all.
But she has to just be consistent in those boundaries. I mean, another thing she could do is, so because she's 17, so she's probably going into either her junior or senior year of high school. And
Right.
she's already heading down a road that's going to lead her into some sort of issue with the law,
Probably.
especially if you're not going to school. Because if you're consistently skipping school,
It's not helpful for the girl,
yeah,
because having a high school education, possibly, I'm not saying you guys go to college, but
yeah,
what she does by not graduating is really closes a lot of doors and opportunities.
hmm
And so I think, again, the writer the stepmom, she can continue with those the expectations and the boundaries.
yeah,
Again, it's really ineffective unless she can convince her husband
yeah,
to get on board. That, to me, is the biggest problem in this whole thing
right,
that stands out to me, is the abdication by the father of his parental responsibility.
hmm
Because, and I understand the reason why, because he felt bad for his daughter. I get that. I have empathy for it too.
hmm
But that response of not having the boundaries, the expectations, the consequences is absolutely the wrong response.
right. And so, but things are going to change though when she turns 18 and she becomes a legal adult, right?
Right.
Things are going to be different. And so they need to decide, or she needs, what I would also recommend doing is going to her husband and saying, okay, when she turns 18, what is our plan? Are we going to continue to allow her living in this house with these behaviors? Or do we have to just tell her she needs to find a place of her own, right? So, what are our options?
That is a really good idea, Liz. The problem is the husband
Yeah,
is not that involved and won't
right.
set the boundaries. And so that's why I said earlier, if this stepmom had been doing this on her own, it probably would be a better outcome.
Right.
But she has to make those decisions with the bio dad. And I would guess it's highly unlikely, given the history that we've got in this story.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's highly unlikely that he's going to set boundaries now when she hits 18. I mean, it's just another age,
Yeah.
And so the pattern between dad and his daughter is pretty well established, for those 17 years. And it sounds to me like even the extended family, so grandparents. But putting up with or just dismissing the behavior is never going to be helpful for a child. In this case, it's not going to be helpful for this
Yeah.
young lady. I do feel bad for her because she has not learned how essentially to get along in society.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you go to, antisocial personality disorder, those people have a real hard time getting along in society. I mean, it affects everything. It affects employment, it affects friendships, it affects intimate relationships, it affects
Yeah.
all of that. And so sadly, because the dad did not step up, I think he set this girl up for some really difficult times. And that's sad throughout her life. Very, very difficult. Now, can she change that? People who listen to us know I'm pretty optimistic about people's behavior to change it. But I think she'd have to get into some serious therapy and help and guidance from someone who could really help her see that she, at some point, I don't think she can see it now. And the reason is I think that immature frontal lobe,
Yeah.
that we've talked about. And at some point, everyone says it's 25 is when it changes, but it's somewhere in there. As she matures and her brain matures, hopefully, she can get hooked up with someone who can really start to help her change her own behavior, because she's going to have to do it on her own. I don't think
Yeah.
I don't think dad or stepmom have much power or control anymore.
And maybe that's an approach that this listener could take is like, look at the road that she is headed down. In order for her to start making changes, she's going to have to hit rock bottom. And I think that's often the case in these instances. They have to hit rock bottom, which often means being either homeless or in jail, right?
Right. But, so I agree with rock bottom. I'm going to add a point. She has to hit rock bottom with a mature frontal lobe.
Right.
For it to make any difference.
Exactly. And
so if
so
she hits rock bottom while she still has that immature brain, I don't know that it makes any difference.
Right. Well, if she hits one of those, then maybe she'll kind of start to self-reflect and say, okay, how did I get to this point? What can I do to change? 17 is
17-year-olds
not like, it's not likely to happen. And so again, the only thing this listener can do is just try to go to her husband and say, look, this is the path that she's already on. If we don't set boundaries, we are going to keep enabling her, because that's another big thing is that I don't think that this girl's father understands, that he is enabling the behavior by not setting these boundaries. It's just going to get worse.
That's right.
And so, and if nothing else, all this listener can do is just continue to set the boundaries and do her best to shelter her other kids from this behavior.
That's right. And so, as most parents know, 17-year-olds are notoriously unable to self-reflect.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know that I would expect that. See, I think that maybe that's another takeaway for this stepmom, is that at 17, I think we start to expect our children to behave more adult-like, which that is not an unreasonable expectation.
Right.
But in this case, I don't know that that's reasonable, just because of the experience and how this 17-year-old has been raised. Again, very sad. And so I think for the stepmom to understand this stepdaughter is not going to have self-reflection. She's not going to be able to see that what she's doing is harmful. The behavior in a lot of ways sounds out of control. Now, the stepmom didn't write that, but it seems like it's out of control. And so what the empathy part is, if that 17-year-old has out of control behavior, can you imagine how internally she feels?
Right.
She probably feels out of control. And that's why, earlier I said, if the parents early on can set those boundaries, that gives the kid safety.
Hmm. And
And that's
so,
what they missed, that she's unsafe and
right.
she's reacting as if she's unsafe.
Right. And so, because another thing she says is that the daughter is doing drugs and skipping school. And she says those are not
Hmm.
acceptable living in our home. But it sounds like the dad has not set the boundaries against that. And so
Right, right.
there's nothing she can do there.
In a lot of ways, I mean, here's another takeaway. I'm sorry about this. In a lot
Yeah.
of ways, she's powerless.
Yes. Yeah. Because this kid is 17
Yeah.
and is like, and that's the thing is, as a lot of parents, when their kids start making these mistakes, is their initial reaction is to put a tighter hold on. When it
Hmm.
sounds like this dad has kind of done the opposite, but oftentimes what parents want to do is they want to create more restrictions, more boundaries, more control, which also doesn't work either because when a kid is
No,
determined to make poor choices, they're going to find a way to make poor choices.
right. I've tried to describe this. Somebody called
Yes.
it the V of love, and it's that more control as the child is younger,
Yes.
and then as they get older, you loosen up and you let them become more self-regulating. And the problem, what you're describing, is you flip that,
Yep.
and so what happens is a lot of people no constraints as they're younger. As they get older, the behavior becomes harder, and they try and put more constraints on. That does not work
No.
at 17 because they're trying to become autonomous anyway, right?
Right.
So you have all these developmental stages that older adolescent is going through, and then all of a sudden someone comes in and essentially sticks them in jail. That's never going to work.
Yep.
Just not.
And well, then the opposite is what it sounds like this dad did the opposite, right? I mean, he didn't place enough constraints around her as a child. And so this this V got bigger and as she had more agency and more options to make choices, she took too much. And so she's
Right.
going to be, I mean, it sounds like she's going to end up incarcerated with no freedoms and
Right.
no privileges because,
Right. In this case, the way I would view it is there is no V, but
yeah,
it was just I mean, it was just open. There
yeah,
were no constraints imposed by the dad.
yeah,
The stepmom tried,
yep,
but again, as we've pointed out so many times, if you've got two parents in the home, you've got to be a parenting team.
right.
You've got to be on the same page.
Yeah, because if one parent's trying to set boundaries and the other parent's is just, I mean, it's just going to say, no, do whatever you want, this child is
That's right.
naturally going to gravitate because kids
Right.
don't want to do things that are
That's
inherently good
right.
for them. My kids don't want to go to bed at a reasonable time
No.
and get enough sleep. But
Yeah.
as a parent, my responsibility is to make sure they're getting adequate sleep,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And
And there's so much that comes from just that simple thing.
yeah,
One, my parent is in control. I feel safe.
yep,
And two, I'm learning some behaviors that will serve me well through the rest of my life. And
yeah,
so this 17-year-old did not get that.
yeah.
Or, I want to acknowledge the stepman tried.
Hmm.
But again, it's a setup for failure because just as you just said, if one is trying to impose, the consequences and expectations, and the other is just saying, "Oh, do whatever you want," the child's always going to gravitate to that parent.
Yep,
Plus, in this case, it's the bio father.
yes,
So,
yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, again, to this listener, I mean, just keep setting the boundaries and keep trying. Now, I want to say that when you're trying to approach your husband about this, use what we call the soft startup, right? So go to
right?
him
Yeah, yeah,
and say, and if you come in at this from like, I am concerned about these behaviors. I want to set her up for success. Is there something that we can do together to help maybe correct some of these behaviors? And if you come into this from a gentle of I want to help, I want to improve, he's more likely to be receptive.
right. And also from the standpoint you used the word "we," I think
Yes.
you have to use the word "we." So I'm cautioning the stepmom. If
Hmm.
she goes to him and says, "Well, I heard that you failed in your duties as a parent,"
Right,
that
right.
is not going to go over well. And so
No.
you have approach it from what can we do now
Yes.
in this moment. It's not going to be helpful to go back and look at what they didn't do in this
Yes.
case. It's just not.
Yeah.
And so if you approach it, what are we going to do now? Which you said earlier, do we, when she gets 18, does she stay here? If she doesn't abide by our rules? But the most important thing that I think is going to be a challenge for the stepmom is she and her husband have to be a parenting team. And it seems like she's tried to do that,
Right.
and he hasn't been on board. So you're absolutely right. The word she uses, the soft startup, using the word we, not going back in the past and saying you did this wrong.
Yeah.
That is absolutely going to be unhelpful. It's
Yeah.
forward looking. What are we going to do together to help her?
Yeah. What can we do to correct these behaviors? Because if you point out, I mean, because skipping school, getting involved in drugs, that's a bad road to start on at 18.
Right.
Or at 17 and 18. She's going to end up in trouble with the law. And if you can say, I would like to prevent further destruction of her life, or maybe not those words, but I would like to, or maybe even come at it from this, because she mentioned she has a girlfriend and it's a controlling and toxic relationship.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if this is an intimate girlfriend. We can kind of assume that it is, but that might be another issue of, look at this relationship that she's in. This is not healthy. Can we help her somehow to see this terrible relationship she's in?
Right. But see, the other thing, I don't know if this is true, but I wonder, is she in that controlling relationship because that's what she missed?
Yep. I think that is.
She didn't get that from the parents, and so she gravitates towards someone who's going to control her.
And that was my exact thought too, is that she's in this controlling relationship because she's looking for somebody to set boundaries with her. But
they aren't good boundaries, though.
No,
she's not.
They're not. Yes. I mean, when you're in a relationship with somebody, any type of relationship, whether it be intimate or friendship, it is not appropriate for that person to set the same boundaries that a parent would set. That's very, very inappropriate. And so if that's what this girlfriend is doing, well, that's toxic and controlling. And so there's a lot of different avenues that this listener can say, that can go through to say, look at this behavior. How can we help? Right. Yeah. And that might be a way, because obviously this dad cares very, very much about his daughter and wants what's best for her. And that is her in. That is her avenue in.
That's right. And so the main takeaway, I think, is forward looking.
Yeah.
How can we help this girl? That's what I'd say.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So as I mentioned, we are going to circle back to suicide prevention. And so we are hopefully going to have a guest from somebody who they call it the 988 office. So this is a government office that works with the 988 hotline, which is the suicide and mental health crisis hotline that you can call if you or someone you know is feeling suicidal. So I'm really excited to have this guest. We're still working on all the kinks, but it should be coming. And we're going to circle back to that next week. All right. We will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.